On July 2, 2025, inside a quiet genetics lab in London, a team of scientists stared at a computer screen and felt something close to fear. They had just finished analyzing DNA pulled from a 4,800-year-old tooth, and the numbers on the screen did not match anything they expected. For over a century, Egypt had guarded its secrets so well that scientists believed real genetic proof from the age of the pyramids might never exist. And now, staring back at them, was a result so strange that it would force historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about the birth of one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Somewhere in that string of genetic code was proof that ancient Egypt was not what anyone imagined it to be. And once this data went public, it would not just add a footnote to history, it would blow a hole straight through it. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back more than 100 years to 1902, when a British excavation team led by archaeologist John Garstang was digging through a rocky hillside near a small village called Nuweirat, about 265 kilometers south of Cairo. Inside a tomb cut directly into the cliff, they found something unusual. A man's body had been sealed inside a large ceramic pot, buried before the Egyptians had fully developed the mummification techniques that would later make their culture famous. Nobody in 1902 understood what they had really found. The bones were quietly shipped to Liverpool, catalogued, and left in storage for over 100 years, where they were kept in the Egyptian village of Nuweirat. A burial donated while under British rule to an excavation committee, initially housed at the Liverpool Institute of Archaeology before moving to the World Museum, Liverpool. For decades, this skeleton sat in a museum drawer as just another artifact, unaware that it was holding the key to unlocking one of the biggest genetic mysteries in Egyptology. Here is the problem that scientists had been fighting for almost 100 years. Egypt's climate is brutal on DNA. The same heat and sun that preserved pyramids and temples for thousands of years actively destroys the fragile genetic material inside bones and teeth. Every time researchers tried to pull usable DNA from ancient Egyptian remains, the samples had degraded into useless fragments. The first real breakthrough came in 1985, when geneticists managed to extract only partial DNA from Egyptian remains, a tiny crack of hope but nowhere near a full genome. For the next 4 decades, that record stood. Scientists had bits and pieces, fragments of fragments, but never anything close to a complete genetic blueprint of a person who lived in the age of the Pharaohs. Every attempt after that hit the same wall: decay, contamination, and Egypt's punishing heat, turning what should have been genetic gold into genetic dust. Then, almost exactly 40 years after that first partial success, a team from the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University decided to try again with the Nuweirat skeleton. The same one dug up by British archaeologists back in 1902. This time, they had a new trick. Instead of targeting bone, which usually fails, they focused on the roots of the man's teeth, specifically a dental tissue called cementum that locks a tooth into the jaw. Cementum turns out to be an extraordinary vault for ancient genetic material, far better preserved than bone because of how densely it's packed and how it's shielded inside the jaw. Researchers took small samples from the root tips of one of the man's teeth, analyzing the cementum because it is an excellent tool for DNA preservation. Out of 7 separate extractions from that single tooth, only 2 produced anything usable, but those 2 were enough. The scientists then compared this ancient Egyptian genome against more than 3,000 modern people and 805 other ancient individuals from populations around the world, running the data through statistical models built specifically to detect where a person's ancestors really came from. What they found was not a clean story of a single, isolated Egyptian bloodline stretching back unchanged for thousands of years, the kind of story many people grew up believing. Instead, the genome told a much more complicated tale. The first complete ancient Egyptian genome showed that this 4,800-year-old man had mostly North African ancestry, but with a significant Neolithic Mesopotamian component mixed in. Break that down and the numbers get even more specific. Roughly 77.6% of his ancestry traced back to populations similar to Middle Neolithic Moroccans, representing deep North African roots, while 22.4% traced directly back to Neolithic populations from Mesopotamia, the region we now call Iraq and parts of Syria. Some outlets rounded this to a simpler split, reporting that about 80% of his genetic material came from ancient North African populations while 20% traced back to people from West Asia and the Mesopotamian region. Either way, the takeaway was the same: and it landed like an earthquake in the field of Egyptology. This was not just trade goods moving across a desert, this was people. Actual human migration, actual mixing of bloodlines, happening right at the dawn of one of history's most iconic civilizations. For decades, historians had debated a nagging question. Egypt and Mesopotamia, sitting on opposite ends of the ancient Middle East, developed eerily similar innovations around the same time, things like early writing systems, sophisticated pottery, and organized city-states. The going theory was that these ideas spread through trade and cultural contact, merchants and travelers carrying concepts back and forth without much actual population movement. This new genome blew that theory wide open. It provided rare direct genetic evidence supporting the idea that the cultural links between Egypt and Mesopotamia included actual migration, not just trade. In plain terms, people from Mesopotamia weren't just trading pottery techniques with Egyptians from a distance. They were moving into the Nile Valley, having children, and passing on their DNA to the very population that would go on to build the first pyramids. The lead author of the study put it simply, noting that piecing together every clue from this man's DNA, bones, and teeth allowed them to build a comprehensive picture of a life lived 4,800 years ago, and that future samples might reveal exactly when this westward movement out of Asia truly began. But the ancestry breakdown was only half of the shock. Once scientists had the genetic data, they didn't stop there. They cross-referenced it with isotope analysis, a chemical fingerprint left behind in teeth that records what a person ate and where they lived as a child. Chemical signals in the man's tooth recorded information about the environment where he grew up and the diet he consumed during childhood, and the results were consistent with a childhood spent in the hot, dry climate of the Nile Valley, eating wheat, barley, animal protein, and plants associated with Egypt. So despite carrying a significant chunk of Mesopotamian ancestry, this man was Egyptian through and through in how he lived. He wasn't a recent immigrant himself. His mixed heritage stretched back generations before him, meaning that population blending had already happened long before he was even born. Then came the part of the story that turned this from a genetics paper into something that felt almost personal. Scientists carefully studied his actual skeleton, and the picture that emerged was strange, even contradictory. Bioarchaeologist Joel Irish estimated the man was between 44 and 64 years old at the time of his death, an unusually advanced age for that period of history, and his skeleton showed clear evidence of osteoarthritis along with muscle development consistent with a life of hard physical labor. Specific details in his bones painted an even more vivid picture. Researchers noted that the markings on his skeleton offered real clues into his lifestyle. Seat bones that had expanded from long hours in one position, arms that showed signs of repetitive back and forth movement, and severe arthritis concentrated specifically in his right foot. Piecing all of that together, the team concluded he most likely spent his life as a potter, with the arthritis in his foot matching the repetitive motion of operating a pottery wheel, a technology that had just arrived in Egypt around the time he was alive. Here is where the story takes its strangest turn. A potter, by every social standard of ancient Egypt, was a working-class laborer. Yet this man was buried with a level of care and ceremony that simply did not match his profession. He was sealed inside a ceramic pot, placed inside a rock-cut tomb designed to protect the body, an arrangement usually reserved for people of much higher status. One of the study's co-authors admitted this was the detail that puzzled the team the most, pointing out that this kind of higher-class burial treatment was not something a working potter would typically receive. So who was he really? Was he a master craftsman so skilled that his work elevated his status? Was he connected by family or patronage to someone powerful? Nobody knows for certain, and that unanswered question is part of what makes this discovery so haunting. A man was pulled out of anonymity by his own DNA, only to leave behind a brand new mystery in its place. Scientists didn't stop at numbers and bone analysis. They wanted to see his face. Using detailed three-dimensional scans of his skull, forensic artist Carolyn Wilkinson and her team at Liverpool John Moores University's Face Lab painstakingly rebuilt his likeness. Muscle by muscle, layer by layer, the same techniques used in modern forensic reconstructions for police investigations. What emerged was the face of a real person, someone with defined features, someone who lived and breathed and worked with his hands nearly 5,000 years ago. A face nobody had seen in almost 50 centuries. But the scientists were careful to add an important warning. This one face does not represent every person who lived in ancient Egypt at that time, any more than any single modern person could represent an entire continent today. This was one man's story, one specific genetic snapshot, not a blanket portrait of an entire civilization. Still, it stood as an extraordinary milestone. Previously, the oldest DNA ever recovered from ancient Egypt came from 3 mummies buried at the Abusir el-Melek necropolis, dated between 787 and 23 BC, and even those only produced partial genomes. This new genome wasn't partial, it was complete, and it belonged to someone who lived roughly 1500 years earlier than any previous sample. As one of the lead researchers explained during a press briefing, this genome allowed scientists, for the very first time, to get real insight into the genetic ancestry of an actual Old Kingdom Egyptian, the era when the first true pyramids were rising out of the desert. Now here is where the story widens, because this new Wirat man was not royalty. He wasn't a pharaoh, not even close, but his DNA cracked open a door that led straight to Egypt's most famous king, and once scientists walked through that door, the secrets of the pharaohs themselves came tumbling out. Rewind back to February of 2010, in Cairo, where a team led by Egypt's top archaeologist at the time, Zahi Hawass, released the results of a 2-year investigation that had never been attempted before, a full genetic study of Egyptian royal mummies, including the most famous mummy on the planet, Tutankhamun. The team extracted DNA from the bones of 11 different mummies and published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was, in itself, historic. Scientists were finally applying real genetic science to bodies that had been mummified, sealed in tombs, and left undisturbed for over 3,000 years. And what they found rewrote everything people thought they understood about the boy king. For decades, popular culture had painted Tutankhamun as a golden, powerful young pharaoh, the glittering face of ancient Egypt thanks to his dazzling burial mask. The DNA and accompanying CT scans told an entirely different story. Geneticist Carsten Pusch from Germany's University of Tübingen described a frail, weak boy who had something of a clubfoot and who needed a cane just to walk, a picture about as far from the strapping warrior pharaoh of movies and legend as you can get. Scans revealed Tutankhamun had a genuine physical disability. He was buried, strangely enough, with over 100 walking sticks in his tomb, and researchers now understood exactly why he needed every single one of them. But the disability was just the beginning. Scientists discovered DNA from the mosquito-borne parasite that causes malaria inside the young pharaoh's body, marking history's oldest known genetically confirmed case of the disease. And it got worse. The team found not just one, but multiple strains of the malaria parasite inside him, indicating he had been infected more than once during his life, and these strains belonged to the most virulent, most dangerous form of malaria known. Combined with a serious fracture already found in his thigh bone during earlier scans, researchers believe this deadly combination, a weakened immune system from repeated malaria infections layered on top of a badly broken leg, may have ultimately killed him. For years, wild theories about King Tut's death had circulated everywhere: murder by blunt force trauma, a chariot accident, even poisoning by rivals within his own court. This new evidence quietly buried nearly all of them, replacing dramatic conspiracy with a much sadder, much more human explanation: a sickly young man whose body had simply been failing him for years. Then came the detail that truly shook the world of Egyptology, the discovery about his parents. Researchers compared the DNA of the mummy believed to be Tutankhamun's father, a controversial pharaoh named Akhenaten who tried to force Egypt to worship a single god, against the DNA of Tutankhamun's mother. What they found stopped the team cold. Geneticist Dr. Yahya Gad, one of the key researchers on the project, later admitted it was something none of them expected going in, saying flatly that they turned out to be brother and sister, which was a massive surprise to the whole team. Tutankhamun's parents were not distantly related nobles playing at royal tradition. They were full siblings, brother and sister, and their son was the product of that direct incestuous union. In ancient Egypt, this wasn't some shocking scandal hidden away in secret. It was practically royal policy. Incest among pharaonic families was an accepted, sometimes even encouraged practice, used to keep bloodlines pure and consolidate power entirely within one family. But biology does not care about royal tradition. Married siblings are far more likely to pass identical harmful genes on to their children, leaving offspring vulnerable to serious genetic defects. and Tutankhamun appears to have paid the price for that biological reality throughout his entire short life. His malformed foot may have been one direct consequence of this inbreeding, and researchers suspect he may have also been born with a partially cleft palate, another congenital defect consistent with generations of close family intermarriage. His grandfather and his own mother reportedly shared the same clubfoot deformity, a hereditary pattern stretching across multiple generations of the same tightly closed bloodline. In short, the golden mask hiding Tutankhamun's mummified face had, for nearly a century, disguised a body wrecked by generations of royal inbreeding, a hidden malaria infection, and a physical disability so severe he could barely walk without support. The DNA study didn't stop there either. It went further back, mapping out Tutankhamun's actual family tree with a level of certainty historians had never had before. Using the genetic data, researchers were able to name several previously anonymous mummies that had only ever been known by tomb numbers, identifying Tut's grandmother as the mummy known as Tai, and confirming his father as the mummy found in tomb Kv 55, most likely the pharaoh Akhenaten. For historians, this was massive. Entire academic careers had been built around debating who exactly some of these mummies were. Genetics settled arguments that pure archaeology alone had failed to resolve for 100 years. And yet, even genetics couldn't answer everything. The study also examined two mummified fetuses found buried alongside Tutankhamun, believed to be his own stillborn daughters, though the genetic analysis suggested they may not have come from his known wife and half-sister Ankhesenamun, leaving the question frustratingly incomplete due to how badly that particular DNA had degraded. Even with cutting-edge science, ancient Egypt still guarded a few of its secrets. Interestingly, the identity of Tutankhamun's own mother remains genuinely unresolved even today. Scientists confirmed she was Akhenaten's sister, but which sister exactly? Out of several candidates historians have debated for years, including the famous Queen Nefertiti, remains an open question. Some Egyptologists have proposed complicated theories involving multiple generations of cousin marriage that could make DNA patterns look deceptively similar to a sibling relationship, meaning Tutankhamun's actual family tree might be even more tangled than the initial 2010 results suggested. In a lecture given years after the original study, French Egyptologist Marc Gaboldi raised exactly this possibility, suggesting that DNA passed down through multiple generations of cousins marrying cousins can end up looking remarkably similar to direct sibling DNA, which would leave the door open for Tutankhamun to actually be the child of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, assuming the two of them were cousins rather than full siblings themselves. It's a reminder that even genetic science, as powerful as it is, still requires careful interpretation, especially when dealing with royal families where cousin marriage, sibling marriage, and generations of intentionally closed bloodlines all overlap and blur together. Now step back and look at both of these discoveries side by side, the Nuweirat potter and the boy king Tutankhamun, separated by more than 1,000 years of history but connected by the same revolutionary science. Together they dismantle a myth that had quietly persisted for generations, the idea that ancient Egypt was some kind of sealed-off, genetically pure civilization that developed in isolation along the Nile and stayed that way for thousands of years. The truth these DNA studies reveal is messier, and honestly far more interesting. Egypt, from its very earliest days, was already a melting pot, absorbing populations from Mesopotamia and blending them with deep North African roots long before the first pyramid stones were ever cut. And at the very top of that same society, the ruling families were doing something almost opposite, deliberately narrowing their own bloodlines through repeated intermarriage in a desperate attempt to preserve perceived divine purity. A decision that left pharaohs like Tutankhamun physically fragile, chronically ill, and dead before the age of 20. There's something almost poetic buried inside this contradiction. While ordinary Egyptians and their ancestors were quietly mixing with people from across the ancient world, creating exactly the kind of genetic diversity that keeps a population healthy and resilient, the royal family at the top was doing the exact opposite, marrying brother to sister, generation after generation, all in the name of keeping their blood as untouched as possible. Nature seems to have handed down its verdict on that strategy through Tutankhamun's own bones, a clubfoot, a cleft palate, chronic malaria, and a body so weak it needed 100 canes just to stay upright. What makes all of this even more remarkable is just how close we came to never knowing any of it. The Nuweirat man's remains sat quietly in a Liverpool museum drawer for over a century before modern technology finally caught up enough to read the story locked inside a single tooth. Tutankhamun's mummy had been studied, scanned, and stared at by millions of tourists for decades before scientists finally extracted usable genetic material from his 11,000-year-old bones. And Egypt's brutal desert heat, the very same climate that helped preserve its monuments and mummies for the world to marvel at, came agonizingly close to destroying the one thing capable of telling us the truth about who these people actually were. Scientists involved in the Nuweirid study have already made clear this is only the beginning. Lead researchers have said they hope future DNA samples pulled from other ancient Egyptian sites can help pin down exactly when this genetic movement from West Asia into the Nile Valley truly started, and how far it eventually spread throughout the wider population. Every new tooth, every new fragment of preserved bone, has the potential to add another piece to a puzzle historians have been trying to solve for well over a century. And somewhere out there, in museum storage rooms and undiscovered tombs still buried beneath the sand, more secrets like these are almost certainly waiting. Ancient Egypt spent thousands of years being remembered as the land of untouchable gods and god-kings, a civilization that seemed almost too perfect, too pure, too eternal to have ever been ordinary. But their own DNA, preserved by pure accident inside a tooth and inside a mummified body, has finally started telling the real story, one of migration, mixing, disability, disease, and deeply human vulnerability hiding just beneath all that gold.